समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
It's been said, I don't know how many million times, that a week is a long time in politics. It's also attributed often to Harold Wilson, although there are questions about that. So if a week is a long time in politics, which is a line I'm repeating now, what is 6 weeks in geopolitics? If you see the last 6 weeks, it's an eternity in geopolitics. Not only is it an eternity, but for some parts of the world, particularly Europe, it might be looking like a little bit of the apocalypse, because the entire security architecture and the arrangement that Europe has had since 1945, since the end of the Second World War, and which got in a way strengthened after the end of the Cold War by 1989-90, that has now been appended, or that is under the threat of being appended. And we saw this play out in public. We saw this play out in public on our TV channels. Everybody saw how Zelenskyy was taken down in that White House dust up between Zelenskyy, the US Vice President J.D. Vance, and then President himself. And then effectively Zelenskyy with his delegation was thrown out. They were told to leave the White House while the trolleys stood there, carts stood there with lunch. They were all supposed to have lunch after signing their agreement or deal. So he was thrown out. Zelenskyy is only one issue. And I will talk about what happened, how the Americans, how the White House then rationalized what happened between them and Zelenskyy and what they did to Zelenskyy. But the impact on Europe is that suddenly the big brother is not there. The big brother under whose Chhatrachaya we built these great welfare states, spending so much on our citizens with so many things provided free, creating this great socialist utopia. That is now over, because the flip side of that coin was that European countries were spending very little on their defense and also doing other quote-unquote luxurious things. For example, their own kind of green politics, where they said we would not take nuclear energy, we will not burn coal. So nuclear energy, they did not need to burn, they thought. Germany, notably, they shut down 4 nuclear plants because the Greens were part of the ruling coalition. And this was one of their conditions, that nuclear plants were shut down. This was done on the presumption that you will keep on buying cheap gas from Russia. So cheap gas from Russia, cheap goods from China, and free security from America. That world now is under threat if it's not been fully appended yet. In any case, Donald Trump now wants these rules rewritten. So before I come to Europe, because that's where the big action took place after the dust-up in White House. After that, Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, called a meeting of European heads of state, like-minded European heads of state, 18 of them, including Zelenskyy, and also the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, and the head of European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, who were just recently in India. Just before London, she was in India with all her European commissioners. Commissioners means ministers. So in a way, the entire cabinet. They were together in London trying to figure out what to do, figuring out European security without America. That's a new thing. That's the reason I said that 6 weeks looks like an eternity in geopolitics, because it has turned geopolitics, the global security architecture, inside out, upside down, or maybe, as the Americans say, you ain't seen nothing yet. So keep watching this space. Now, first of all, see what happened in the White House. And let's put that in perspective a little bit. So after Zelenskyy was sent away, White House fielded 2 key people. They fielded Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who gave multiple interviews, including one to Caitlin Collins of CNN. Now, CNN is an institution, is a platform that Trump administration sees as hostile. So these people are talking on Fox, on Breitbart, which are seen to be friendly to Trump, but they are also reaching out through other seemingly impartial or hostile media from their point of view. So Marco Rubio, the most interesting and important interview he did, and with great clarity, he speaks very clearly. That was to Caitlin Collins of CNN, and Caitlin Collins is somebody with whom Trump famously keeps on having these arguments at all White House pressers, which usually end by him telling Caitlin Collins, you worry about CNN, your ratings are falling, you make sure CNN survives. I'm not sure, I don't think CNN will survive, and stuff like that. And yet Marco Rubio went and spoke there. Marco Rubio also goes on to say that people need to understand that we are trying to help. The US is trying to help Ukraine, not hurt it. And he said the sooner people grow up and realize that, I think the more progress we are going to be able to make. And he concludes that if Donald Trump was a Democrat, people would be talking of a Nobel Peace Prize for him. Also, Michael Waltz is the new national security advisor. He went out and spoke. He spoke to Fox. He spoke to Breitbart. So what are the highlights from what they said? First of all, they blamed Zelensky for what went wrong. Basically, they were saying that America was trying to help. America wanted peace, and peace would have got Ukraine's security and also saved many lives. But looked like Zelensky had not come prepared for that. Zelensky had come with the idea that he will again be lionized and praised and hero worshipped, called a great fighter, and then promised everything he wanted. And it did not work like that. And then when Zelensky thought he wasn't taken at his word, he got upset, and he ruined the conversation. So Mike Waltz in his interview describes Zelensky's behavior like that of an ex-girlfriend. He said it spoke like an ex-girlfriend and blew it. Marco Rubio, on the other hand, said, look, we have an understanding of what's happening in Ukraine and a policy. It is not the former president's policy. There's a new president. There's a new sheriff in town. There, in front of TV cameras, Zelensky sat down and did so much Ukraine-splaining. So that is, when you meet a big bully, you either keep your mouth shut, right? Or you be non-committal, but you don't contradict a bully. And that too on camera when his people are watching and the world is watching. Rubio is not saying that. I'm interpreting that. That is what Zelensky did wrong, and that's what Ukraine's planning in public means, which Marco Rubio is complaining about. Before that, Donald Trump himself, first of all, at the meeting, he complained that Zelensky was talking too much about Putin. In fact, he said many things that sounded very sympathetic of Putin. That is Donald Trump, Putin and Russia. And talking of Putin, he said he went through a phony witch hunt where they used him and Russia, right? And this is the witch hunt about the old Mueller inquiry against Donald Trump and his alleged Russia connection. And then he said to the press when he was going away to Mar-a-Lago, he said, Zelensky's got to say, I want to peace. He doesn't have to stand there and keep saying Putin this, Putin that. All negative things. Even within the conversation with Zelensky, when Zelensky said of Putin, he hates us. It's not about me. He hates Ukrainians. He thinks Ukraine is not a nation. And Trump interrupted him and said, it is wonderful to speak badly about somebody else. And he said, this is not a love match. That's why you are in this situation. So this was very clear that Trump thought he had an idea on how to bring peace to Ukraine. And he thought that Zelensky should be jumping with joy and maybe signing up on the dotted line on the deal that he was offered. Now, what was the deal? We need to understand that. The criticism is that he was making a big surrender to the aggressor. He was accepting all the demands of Putin. That means he could keep whatever he had already. And then the guarantee that Ukraine will not be in NATO, also no foreign troops will be there, and Ukraine will not have security guarantees. So in a way, Ukraine will become a neighbor with sovereignty, with 20% of its territory lost, with sovereignty, but under the Russian thumb, Russian influence to such an extent that it will be difficult for it to have an independent international or strategic policy or foreign policy. The Trump supporters, on the other hand, say that there is no way, no matter how much support we give Zelensky, there is no way he can evict the Russians from all the land that Russians have occupied already. So this was a situation where a compromise was available. The compromise was generally freeze the lines to where you are right now, maybe persuade the Russians, Putin, to go back a little bit, give up some territory, maybe in exchange for Kursk, the Kursk area that Ukrainians have taken, and there create a demilitarized zone. Create a demilitarized zone between them and sign this critical minerals deal between the US and Ukraine, which the Europeans could join in at some point. Once you had this deal and joint ventures, most of the regions or part of the Ukrainian landmass where critical minerals are found actually falls in the area abutting today's front line. And that, as American companies started coming in, American and European personnel there started coming in to explore for those minerals, would have itself been a security guarantee, because it was unlikely that the Russians will go and invade that area and hurt American citizens working there. That simply is the Trump side of the argument. You want to know more about it? Watch this podcast by Victor Davis Hanson, who is a senior fellow at Hoover Institute in America. He has a regular podcast called The Signal Report. This, I think, projects the Trump point of view in the most coherent manner. And if you see it, it doesn't look like as bad a deal as the Trump critics would make it out to be, which is basically Zelenskyy or Ukraine giving up all their sovereignty. That said, why is Europe so hassled? Europe is so hassled because this is not the classical American position. The classical American position from their point of view would have been that a free, democratic European country has been attacked by Russia, which is a traditional rival, adversary, enemy, whatever. So everybody has to come to Ukraine's defense. And that's what's gone on for the last many years. And that is why even the Russian annexation of Crimea, the Western world has imposed sanctions on Russia. That has not happened this time. And Europe is now realizing that this Trump administration, Trump 2.0 if you so wish, that has a radically different view of Russia and a radically different view of Europe. Now, to understand the importance of this turmoil in Europe, where 18 European leaders met in London without America, that's unusual. That doesn't happen every day because America is always there as the big boss, the big brother, whatever you call it. Not there. And trying to figure out what can they do now. They all find they've denuded themselves of military strength all this while, presuming that the Americans will be there. The American fire truck will always be there to put out the fires that come up in their neighborhood. That is not available right now, at least not for now. We have to remember also that every world war, both world wars, were actually European wars. The world gets destabilized mainly because, or probably only because, of the inability of Europeans to coexist with each other. Because even before the world wars, they were the Anglo-French wars, wherever other European countries were fighting, and other countries get drawn into them. The two wars were called world wars simply because troops from the colonies of these big powers were drawn in. Otherwise, why would India raise an army of 2.5 million, which is 2.5 times of our army now, to go and fight for the Allies or for the British? Because we were a colony, and many colonies got drawn in like that. And also, once that turmoil gripped the Western world, then other people took advantage, like the Japanese in the Second World War. In both the wars, the second thing, first of all, these were essentially European wars. And second, in each one, Europe could take America's support for granted. Second World War, America took some time, again working on the same presumption that Trump repeats now, that we have these two beautiful oceans. But that presumption was challenged when Japan went and attacked Pearl Harbor, and then the Americans joined in. So presumption being that anytime Europe has trouble, the Americans will come in. That today is challenged, and that's caused such a humongous anxiety in Europe now. Now today there are no colonies, right? So you can't say that today Europe will go to war and Britain will bring its own colonial troops, or maybe Russia has some colonies someplace. No, or Russia has the larger Soviet system with so many republics None of that exists now. However, the destabilization that's taken place now is global. It's global because while this turmoil is going on in Europe, Trump has actually gone to war with the entire world on trade, because global trade has been set into a pattern by WTO, many bilateral for free trade agreements. All of that's now been challenged by Trump, and that's where what could have remained so far in Europe, and we could have just sat on the sidelines. We could have also said we got a beautiful ocean between us and Europe and watched the fun. But that doesn't apply because Trump's trade war now targets China, it targets India, and most certainly it targets his next door neighbors, that is Canada and Mexico. Trump, if anything, you can see the pattern. He uses much more insulting language, deliberately insulting and humiliating language about his allies or those he sees as being dependent on him. That's why Governor Trudeau, for example, that's why tariffs on Mexico and Canada at a very high level, while he thinks about other places at the same time. But if the globalized trading system is shaken like this and he completely rewrites all the equations, then it's going to matter to India a great deal, because India has that big trade surplus, and you can see that India has already begun to make adjustments in its tariffs. Because as you can see, nobody wants to fight a bully unless the bully comes threatening your sovereignty. And how a bully can threaten your sovereignty, you can see in what Trump is doing to Canada. In fact, Justin Trudeau was in London. He was the only non-European leader attending this meeting of 18 leaders called by Keir Starmer, where it was reported that he will take up with King Charles Trump's threats to annex Canada or make it America's 51st state. Because remember, Canada follows the original Commonwealth model. So the monarch of United Kingdom is also the monarch of Canada. Now, where does it leave India? India is very far from this spat. India has taken a very careful position on Ukraine, basically saying this is not the era of war. It can be a lecture to anybody. It's also not supporting Putin's position. So it's been a very carefully crafted position. So that fire India is out of. India is not in that firing line. At the same time, India has its own challenges in the neighborhood. So we don't know how Trump, which side of the bed will he wake up on Pakistan tomorrow, something on Bangladesh, who knows, and China. That is the big issue, because right now, he and his people are using very hostile language on China. But the fact is that many of the oligarchs that back him also have interests in China. And China is a big, humongous power. If he goes on imposing these tariffs on China, it's bound to increase inflation in his country, which is what he doesn't want. So chances are, at some point, he will go and make a deal with China as well. That's the Trump method. The Trump method is to make maximalist demands, then get something and declare victory. See what he did with Hamas. He said by this Saturday, unless all hostages are released, there is going to be hell to pay. And what happened that Saturday? Hamas released 3 hostages, 3 in return for 300 something of prisoners that Israel gave in exchange. And after that, Trump declared victory, and he said until the other day, they were not even talking of releasing any hostages. The fact is, Hamas still has a lot of hostages. So that's a Trump method. Will he do something like that with China? If it does something like that with China, where will it leave India? Because how important will India be in his calculations then? That is something India has to worry about. Although this year in September, the Quad Summit takes place in India, in Prime Minister Narendra Modi's present, Donald Trump used an expression for the Quad which I have not seen an American president or top official use in Prime Minister Modi's presence. He called it a security alliance. He called it a Quad security alliance. You will never find India officially calling it that. But you know what? Between now, which is early March and September, when the Quad Summit is supposed to take place in India, there is 6 months. We just told you what a long time. In fact, an eternity in geopolitics can 6 weeks be. This is 6 months. We don't know what will happen. Trump administration has already said that they will not be attending the next G20 summit because it's in South Africa and they have issues with South Africa. In fact, Elon Musk is now openly interfering in the internal politics of South Africa. He's also describing South African whites as among the most oppressed minorities. He's directly attacking President Cyril Ramaphosa. And then the next G20 summit, maybe the Americans don't go for this one, G20 will survive. But the next G20 summit is scheduled to be held in America. So that's one more multilateral organization whose fate now hangs in the balance. To understand the state of this world, I can find words no better than those spoken by Alex Younger, former MI6 chief, that's the British External Intelligence Chief, James Bond's company. He spoke to the BBC and he said, and I quote, "We are in a new era where by and large, its relations are not going to be determined by rules and multilateral institutions, but by strongmen and deals." And when you look at strongmen and deals, you can see that in America, there is a strongman. There is no strongman in Europe. And what the Americans are targeting is, because they see Europe as being vulnerable, they are targeting something that's called a Brussels effect. Brussels is the capital of EU, and that's where they use the European power to set rules in many areas. These can be ideological, strategic, or economic. Now, this America wants Europe to lose that power, because Europe also uses that power to establish global rules and norms, and it's particularly important in the realms of climate regulation, digital competition that affects the tech bros that Donald Trump feels so strongly about, platform accountability. That's the reason you see this taxes and fines on Google, etc. in Europe, and also artificial intelligence. Again, to understand this, I will give you two more lines of thinking. One, of course, is something that you are familiar with. That is S. Jaishankar, who once said famously and quite correctly that Europe thinks that its problems are the entire world's problems, but none of the world's problems are Europe's. And finally, the view of all this from the other side of the battlefront, that is the Kremlin. Dmitry Peskov has been quoted by official Russian agency as saying, and I quote, "The collective West has partially ceased to be collective, and the fragmentation of the collective West has begun." That's how important these developments have been.